The White House was a fortress of calculated movements and unspoken tension that day. The sun bore down on the south lawn as a motorcade rolled through the gates, carrying Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, his expression unreadable behind the tinted glass of his armored SUV. Inside the West Wing, Karoline Leavitt adjusted the cuff of her blazer, glancing at the series of monitors in the press office. The air was thick with urgency. Trump's meeting with Zelensky was more than just another diplomatic handshake. It was a high-stakes negotiation that would set the tone for U.S. Ukraine relations in Trump's second term. The world's eyes were on Washington, particularly those of Russia, whose ever-looming presence in Eastern Europe made this meeting all the more volatile. Karoline, now the youngest White House press secretary in history, had spent the last 24 hours ensuring that every detail of the media access was airtight. Security had been doubled, press credentials were scrutinized, and background checks were run twice over. The last thing the administration needed was an unnecessary spectacle. The Roosevelt Room, where the meeting was set to take place, had been prepped down to the smallest details. A glass pitcher of water sat between the two world leaders. American and Ukrainian flags stood proudly behind their seats. The doors would remain closed, with only select press allowed in for a brief photo session before the talks began. Everything was as controlled as it could be. Or so they thought. The tension in the press briefing room was palpable as journalists were ushered through security checkpoints, their credentials triple-checked by Secret Service. As Karoline walked past the podium, she nodded to her team. So far, everything was running smoothly. But then, a flicker of movement caught her attention. A man, tall, dark-haired, his press badge clipped onto his lapel, was speaking in hushed tones with another journalist. His eyes darted around the room, his body language off. Karoline's instincts, honed through years of working in political communications, immediately told her something was wrong. She subtly signaled to a nearby Secret Service agent, who moved toward the man in question. Within moments, the agent was running the press badge through the verification system. The result came back red. The name on the badge was real, belonging to a Russian journalist from a well-known state-run media outlet, but the photo didn't match. Someone had infiltrated the White House press corps. Karoline's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a routine security oversight, this was deliberate. She had seen firsthand how foreign adversaries manipulated narratives, planted misleading stories, and sought to disrupt delicate diplomatic moments. And now, someone had slipped through, during a meeting between Trump and Zelensky. With measured steps, Karoline walked toward the man. The room was bustling with journalists setting up their cameras, unaware of what was unfolding. She reached the infiltrator just as the Secret Service agent leaned in. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice steady but firm, "may I see your press credentials again?" The man hesitated. His hesitation alone confirmed her suspicions. He attempted to maintain composure, but the weight of scrutiny pressed against him like a vice. "I already showed them at the entrance," he responded, his accent faint but present. He attempted a nonchalant smile, but Karoline saw through it. "That's not your photo," she replied coolly. "You need to come with us." The moment stretched unbearably long. The journalist's eyes darted to the press pool, to the Secret Service agent beside him, then back to Karoline. And then he made the mistake. He turned to walk away. Immediately, the Secret Service agent blocked his path. Another agent moved in, and within seconds, the entire room was aware of the disturbance. Cameras turned, microphones were raised, murmurs erupted. Karoline stood firm, not letting a flicker of hesitation cross her face. "Take him out," she said quietly to the agents. The journalist, or whoever he was quickly escorted out of the room. The murmurs among the press grew louder, and Karoline knew what was coming. She took a deep breath, stepped up to the podium, and faced the sea of journalists head-on. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice unwavering, "we just encountered a breach of protocol. Rest assured, security measures are in place, and the matter is being handled. The President's meeting with President Zelensky will proceed as scheduled." A flurry of hands shot up, voices overlapping. "Who was that man? Was he a Russian agent? Is this an international security threat?" Karoline held up a hand. "We are investigating the situation, and we will provide updates as soon as they are available. For now, I ask that we remain focused on today's diplomatic discussions." She didn't wait for further questions. She turned on her heel and walked swiftly toward the West Wing, where she knew President Trump and Zelensky were about to begin their discussion. But inside, she knew, this was no accident. Someone had planned this. And they weren't done yet. Karoline Leavitt walked swiftly down the West Wing corridor, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The weight of what had just transpired pressed on her mind, but there was no time to dwell on it. The Russian journalist, or imposter, had been removed, but the implications of his presence in the White House press corps were disturbing. Inside the Roosevelt Room, President Trump and President Zelensky were seated across from each other, their expressions carefully neutral as cameras flashed. The tension in the room was palpable. Trump's second-term foreign policy stance toward Ukraine had been a balancing act, supporting Ukraine's sovereignty while simultaneously avoiding direct military entanglements. Zelensky, aware of the delicate position his country was in, had arrived in Washington seeking renewed commitments. Karoline entered the room quietly, taking her usual spot by the side, just as Trump leaned in toward Zelensky. "I've always said," Trump's voice carried, "that we want peace, but peace requires strength. We're willing to support Ukraine, but we need to know where every dollar is going." Zelensky nodded, his face unreadable. "Mr. President, Ukraine has been fighting for its survival. We are grateful for the continued U.S. support. But we also need clarity. Are we partners in this fight, or are we on our own?" The room fell silent. Trump glanced toward his national security advisor, who sat with arms crossed, and then back at Zelensky. Before he could respond, the doors burst open. A senior Secret Service agent stepped inside, his face tense. He walked straight toward Karoline and leaned in, speaking low enough so only she could hear. "The journalist we removed, he wasn't alone," he said. Karoline's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" she asked, keeping her expression controlled. The agent hesitated before continuing. "We identified a second individual in the press pool with questionable credentials. He left just before we caught the first one. We're running his ID now, but there's something else. You need to see this." Karoline knew better than to panic in the presence of the two world leaders. Instead, she nodded subtly and followed the agent out of the room. The moment they were in the hallway, the agent handed her a tablet with a live security feed. There, on the screen, was the second man, inside the White House, moving toward the East Wing. He wasn't part of the press pool anymore. Karoline's heart pounded. If this was a coordinated effort, it was bigger than an imposter in a press conference. She turned back to the agent. "Where is he now?" "We lost him for a few minutes," the agent admitted, "but we have security sweeping the area. He was last seen near the communications office." That set off alarms in Karoline's mind. The communications office housed some of the most sensitive materials related to the president's daily briefings, messaging strategies, and upcoming policies. If someone had access to those files, even for a few minutes, it could be catastrophic. "Lock down that wing," she ordered. "I want every unauthorized person identified immediately." The agent nodded and barked orders into his earpiece. Karoline exhaled sharply. This wasn't just a simple security breach. Someone was actively trying to gain information, disrupt the administration, or possibly worse, send a message. She turned on her heel and headed back toward the Roosevelt room. The president needed to know. But just as she reached the doors, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She glanced at the caller ID. It was an unknown number. For a split second, she debated ignoring it. Then instinct took over, and she answered. Ms. Leavitt, a male voice on the other end spoke, smooth and calculated. "You should really check your security protocols." Karoline froze mid-step. The voice wasn't familiar, but the implication was clear. Whoever was behind this was watching. Before she could respond, the line went dead. She clenched her jaw. This was no ordinary security breach. Someone had just tested the White House's defenses and walked away unscathed. And that meant they'd be back. Karoline Leavitt stood frozen, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The unknown caller had just delivered a chilling message. "You should really check your security protocols." It wasn't just a taunt. It was a warning. Her mind raced. Who was this? And more importantly, how did they get her direct line? The White House press secretary didn't just have her number floating around. It was restricted to top administration officials, security personnel, and a handful of trusted media contacts. But this caller had it. Which meant one of two things. Either they were an insider or someone had breached White House communication systems. She didn't have time to process the implications. The second infiltrator was still unaccounted for, and the White House was now in potential danger. Karoline spun on her heel and strode back into the Roosevelt room. Trump and Zelensky were still engaged in discussion, but the atmosphere had shifted. Both leaders seemed aware that something was off. Trump, perceptive as ever, had noticed Karoline's sudden departure, and now that she had returned, his eyes locked onto hers, searching for an explanation. She gave him the smallest of nods. "We need to speak in private," she mouthed. That was all Trump needed to see. He abruptly leaned forward, shaking Zelensky's hand. "Let's take a quick pause here," Trump announced, his tone casual but firm. "We'll regroup in a few minutes." Zelensky, though slightly taken aback, nodded. "Of course, Mr. President." As soon as Trump stood, Secret Service agents instantly moved into formation. Karoline took a deep breath and followed him as they exited the Roosevelt room and entered the Oval Office, where Chief of Staff Chris Leavitt was already waiting. Trump turned, facing her with a knowing look. "What's going on, Karoline?" She didn't sugarcoat it. "We have a serious problem." The Russian journalist wasn't alone. A second individual infiltrated the White House and is still unaccounted for. And, sir, I just received an anonymous call. They had my number. Trump's expression darkened. "They what?" Chris Leavitt exhaled sharply, stepping forward. "We need full lockdown procedures. Right now." Trump nodded. "Do it." Karoline turned to the nearest security officer. "I want the entire East Wing sealed off immediately. No one moves without clearance." and sweep all communication networks. If this is a digital breach, we need to know now." The officer nodded and relayed her orders. "Who was the caller?" Trump pressed. Karoline shook her head. "No name. No trace. Just a warning about our security." Trump's expression hardened. "Find out who it was. And tell the press that any reports of a breach are under review. We don't need panic yet." She nodded, already calculating how to control the media narrative while simultaneously dealing with a very real threat inside the White House. Just then, a new voice cut through the tense silence. "Madam Press Secretary, come with me. We found something." She turned. A Secret Service agent was standing in the doorway. His face was pale. That was never a good sign. Without hesitation, she followed. Karoline stepped into a secured meeting room where senior intelligence officers, cybersecurity experts, and top Secret Service personnel were gathered. A large screen dominated the wall, displaying live security footage from various parts of the White House. One video feed had been paused. It showed the second infiltrator. He was walking down a corridor, near the communications office. A file was tucked under his arm. Karoline felt her stomach tighten. "What did he take?" she asked. A cybersecurity officer leaned forward. "We don't know yet. But whatever it was, he was in and out within 4 minutes." Karoline's mind worked fast. There were only a handful of documents in that office that would be worth the risk of sneaking in. One of them, the upcoming press briefing notes for Trump's next major address, one that included classified talking points on U.S. strategy regarding Russia and Ukraine. She turned to the head of Secret Service. "Where is this man now?" The agent exhaled. "He slipped out before we could contain the area. But we're running facial recognition." A beep interrupted him. A technician seated at the front of the room suddenly straightened. "We have an ID." The screen refreshed. A passport photo appeared. The second infiltrator was Russian intelligence. Everything snapped into motion. The White House was locked down. Secret Service moved swiftly, re-verifying every staffer and journalist inside. Every exit was guarded, and outside communications were being closely monitored. Trump was briefed immediately. When he heard the name and saw the face of the infiltrator, his reaction was swift. "Tell them to check every embassy flight leaving Washington. I want that bastard found." But there was another problem. The press was starting to get wind of the situation. Inside the press briefing room, journalists were whispering among themselves. Something was happening, and they knew it. Karoline had minutes, maybe seconds, to get ahead of the story before it spiraled out of control. She grabbed her phone and dialed her deputy. "Prepare a controlled briefing. We address this on our terms." 20 minutes later, Karoline stepped up to the podium. The room was packed. Journalists leaned forward, eager for a statement. She looked out at the room and delivered her words with precision. "Good afternoon. Earlier today, the White House encountered an unauthorized individual attempting to gain access to secured areas. Our security measures identified and removed the individual in question. We are working closely with law enforcement to investigate any further threats. At this time, there is no evidence of any classified material being compromised. The President remains fully briefed, and there is no immediate threat to national security." A flood of questions erupted. Was the individual Russian? Is this related to ongoing tensions with Ukraine? Was this a spy operation? Karoline held up a hand. I will not speculate on the identity of the individual at this time. However, the administration takes security extremely seriously, and I can assure the American people that we will not tolerate any breach of trust. The press kept pushing. Karoline stood firm, controlled, unshaken. This was her battlefield, and she had just taken control. The press conference had ended, but the battle had only just begun. As Karoline Leavitt stepped off the podium, she could still hear journalists firing questions behind her, but she didn't look back. She had controlled the narrative for now, but the real fight was happening behind closed doors. She walked swiftly down the hallway, her mind racing. A Russian intelligence operative had infiltrated the White House. He had taken something, and now the entire world was watching. She entered the Situation Room, where the president, senior intelligence officials, and top White House aides were gathered. The atmosphere was tense, electric with urgency. Trump was seated at the head of the table, his face unreadable. Next to him, Chief of Staff Chris LaCivita was reviewing a file. Across the table, National Security Advisor Michael Flynn leaned forward, his fingers pressed together. As soon as Karoline took her seat, Trump looked up. "What's the damage?" he asked. The room fell silent as the head of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, cleared his throat. "We've confirmed that the infiltrator accessed files related to the president's upcoming statement on Ukraine," he said. "It's likely that some of our strategic talking points have been compromised." Karoline's jaw clenched. That meant the Russians now knew exactly what Trump planned to say about Ukraine. Trump leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "So what you're telling me is, Moscow has our playbook?" Flynn nodded grimly. "Yes, sir. And they could manipulate it before we even make our move." Karoline took a deep breath. This was bad. The entire diplomatic strategy could be flipped against them. Then, another voice entered the conversation. "Mr. President, we just got word from Langley," the CIA director said. "There's chatter from Russian state media. Something big is coming." A hush fell over the room. "Define something big," Trump said. The CIA director hesitated before answering. "Sir, they're preparing to release falsified documents, fake intelligence meant to look like internal White House memos, showing that your administration is planning to reduce military aid to Ukraine." Karoline's stomach dropped. This was a setup. The Russians hadn't just stolen information, they were using it to craft a false narrative, one designed to undermine Trump's credibility and shake U.S. Ukraine relations. If those fake documents made it into the press, it would cause an international firestorm. Trump sat forward, his hands gripping the table. "So let's be clear about this. They steal our real talking points, then fabricate documents to make us look weak on Ukraine." Karoline nodded. "They want to divide us before we even have a chance to act." A moment of silence passed. Then, Trump stood. "We're not going to let them control this. We go on offense." Karoline knew what she had to do. She had one job: stop the Russian narrative before it took hold. Her plan: flip the script before they could even publish it. She walked straight into the communications war room, where her media team was already in crisis mode. "We're releasing the president's Ukraine statement now." Her deputy blinked. "But, ma'am, it's scheduled for next week." "Not anymore. If we wait, Russia will set the narrative. We drop it first. No leaks, no speculation." Just facts. Her team immediately scrambled into action. Within 30 minutes, the White House released Trump's official statement on Ukraine. It was clear, firm, and left no room for misinterpretation. The United States stands with Ukraine. Any reports suggesting otherwise are false. Karoline then briefed the media directly. She stepped up to the podium once more, looking straight at the cameras. We are aware of ongoing disinformation efforts by foreign actors attempting to manipulate public perception. Let me be clear, any reports suggesting a change in our policy toward Ukraine are categorically false. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. We know who's behind this, and they will not succeed. Boom. Within an hour, Russian state media's attempt to push fake documents fell flat. The American press had already been given the truth, straight from the source. And just like that, Karoline had outplayed them. Hours later, Karoline sat in her office, the adrenaline finally wearing off. A knock at the door made her look up. It was Trump. "You handled that well," he said, stepping inside. "They tried to set the trap, and you made them walk into it." She allowed herself a small smile. "They underestimated us." Trump smirked. "They won't make that mistake again." Karoline nodded, knowing he was right. The Russians had tested them and lost. But this wasn't the last time they would try. The next battle was already on the horizon. And when it came, Karoline Leavitt would be ready.